All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today for the second installment of the 2026-2027 VOX-Pol lecture series. VOX-Pol's purpose is the establishment of a robust partnering, research, training, and dissemination network that has at its core function comprehensive research, analysis, debate, and critique of topics and issues surrounding violent online political extremism. Since 2022, VOX-Pol has been coordinated by Professor Stuart McDonald at Swansea University's Cyber Threat Research Center, and we invite you to visit the VOX-Pol website, which offers a wealth of resources. There you can find a link to sign up for the newsletter, upcoming events, and links to past lectures via our YouTube channel. You can also get information on exciting initiatives such as the Next Gen Network and the Terrorism and Social Media Conference being held this summer in Wales. I am excited to now introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Erin Saltman, who is the Senior Director of Membership and Programs at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. As a practitioner, Dr. Saltman works with international stakeholders across tech, government, and civil society to build cross-platform policies and approaches to counterterrorism and violent extremism online. Today, she will be talking to us about AI threats and opportunities in countering terrorism and countering violent extremism. I will now pass it off to you, Dr. Saltman.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's been great to follow VOX-Pol and its growth through the years and work with Stuart. And I know that some of the people from our team are looking forward to joining you in Swansea University for TASM this coming summer. We were going to just talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, threats, opportunities, policy frameworks, all around how to consider reframing countering terrorists and violent extremists based on new technologies. I'm going to take over your screen now and talk you through a little bit, if you're unsure of what GIFCT is, just a little bit more about what we do, what types of tech companies we work with, and then dive into the AI questions. What do we know is already taking place with AI exploitation? What are some of the fears we have that we haven't yet seen? And then how can we consider some of the opportunities that these new and impressive tools might be providing us? So as a starting point, it's worth looking at who official members of GIFCT working with us are. And you'll note that some of these brand recognitions you're going to have immediately. Big companies everyone's heard of. Some of these are much smaller companies that maybe you've never heard of. Some of these are, in fact, many increasingly are not traditional social media companies. Some of these are in and of themselves AI companies. Some are end-to-end encrypted, so their threat landscape wouldn't be based on user-generated content. Some are audio only. Some are facing marketplace questions, but all of them are being exploited in different ways by terrorists and violent extremists. And for each platform, their signal is going to look a little bit different. A gaming platform is going to have different harm signal than a social media platform, is going to have different signal than a place you go and just hold your content. In fact, if you're a researcher, many of you are guilty of housing terrorist or violent extremist content for research. And so for an entity like Dropbox, how are they supposed to know without context who is housing this content for research purposes and who might be housing this to praise, support, or further share this information? Every company here has to go through a process of meeting our membership criteria, which includes things like having an annual transparency report, having a human rights statement. So you don't just get to join GIFCT. We actually talk you through having certain criteria met, because when we share these larger potent tools and cross-platform information, we want to make sure that that's not going to be abused. Pretty similar to governments, when we talk about tech companies and their approach to something like counterterrorism, we do bucket things in terms of what is prevention, what is responding to real world crisis, and what is about adaptation or learning from errors or seeing where trends are going. Prevention sometimes means something a little bit different to a tech company than it does to somebody in the PCVE space. So prevention might not just be preventing radicalization, it might also be preventing viral spread or preventing further harm from a known harmful trend. When we think of tools that GIFCT is working directly with, we do house a hash sharing database. This is not artificially intelligence driven. This is very basic old school technology. And this allows us to share with our member companies signal that relates to terrorist and violent extremist content. Ask me more about the technicalities of this in Q&A if you're interested. But we didn't just invent this for countering terrorism. We learned this from how we saw other trust and safety practitioners countering child sexual abuse imagery and using it for child safety. And so we do see that we learn from other harm types learn from us on how to safeguard in different ways. But ultimately, hash sharing is just one way to share content related signal without sharing the source content so that other platforms can see if that signal's on their platform. So, for example, if YouTube found a ISIS terrorist official video, they could hash that into the database. It would show up as a string of numbers, and the other companies involved in it could use that to scrape their platform and proactively surface and see where and how that content might have been shared on their platform. So it's a way of cross-platform signal sharing without sharing personally identifiable information of users, which is very helpful for considering privacy and human rights. We do also work on incident response, and this is where there might be a real world terrorist attack, but there are online aspects at play related to that. And those in this sector will be very familiar with things like the Christchurch terrorist attack or the Buffalo attack or Halle, Germany, whereby it's not just an attack. It is also a live streaming or a launch of a manifesto. And those are online elements at play that can be labeled and hashed into our database, and context around that can be shared with members so that they better understand the harmful content associated with a real world attack moment. We also want to make sure that we're understanding regional perspective, and we do go to different parts of the world on the ground to see what things like innovative threats of AI or opportunities and groups to work with, threat trends look like in different parts of the world. We will usually only go and do an event somewhere when we have a local partner so that we can be learning from their ground truth experience and expertise just as much as sharing some of our own about the technical sides of this. And it also allows us to grow our academic network. And so some of you in the room or joining virtually might have already contributed insights in the past, but I would encourage you to do so. I know quite a few people involved in the VOX-Pol network over the years have contributed GNet insights. But this is a place where you can write about anything to do with extremism and technology. I think you get £300 if you contribute an insight. And anytime one of the tech companies we work with is mentioned in these insights, we will directly share it with that company and offer them the opportunity to be put in touch with the researcher. So we are trying to bridge that gap of feeling like researchers are isolated from being able to talk directly with the tech companies. And then before I move on to the AI question more intensely, some of the information that I'm drawing on is not just from our academic network, but each year we convene multi-stakeholder working groups that tackle 3 or 4 topics that no one platform and no one government can solve on their own. So this last year, we're just about to launch an event to show the outputs, some of the best practice guides, some of the reports that came out of our 3 themes. We had an investigators community of practice where AI companies and otherwise were saying what harm signal might actually look like, what they're seeing as the threat trends, what it shows up as in real terms on their platform. We had an AI threats and opportunities working group, and we had an addressing youth radicalization and mobilization working group to look at gaming, youth spaces, how those signals and how the protections around safeguarding those spaces might look different. This year, we're just about to kick off another segment with a gaming and youth focused working group, one on terrorist finance and one on advanced signal sharing. If that interests anyone, please do get in touch. We are just about to launch that literally in a couple of weeks' time. And then lastly, we really do want to look at human rights. So there is a lot that these new tools, when we talk about AI opportunities, there's a lot we could do that maybe we shouldn't do if it encroaches on other human rights, considering things like privacy, free speech, the right to gather. And so at each point, we do work with third parties. We always include human rights voices in our working groups as we develop new tools, as we consider our own programmatic efforts to make sure we're not countering terrorism at the cost of key fundamental human rights. Now on to the AI question. And please do ask me in the Q&A anything about anything mentioned here. I'm going to keep it broad so that we can dive in based on whatever rabbit hole you guys prefer. When we think of the threat, we have seen quite a few different researchers, experts, and tech companies talk about how they're seeing certain trends in exploitation. We want to look at how we might be doing AI safety, so safety layered onto AI systems, as well as how we might be using AI within other safety systems. And we want to always be thinking about recommendations and how stakeholders should be better collaborating on this. Terrorism and violent extremism has always been transnational. Just like all of us on our phones, it is increasingly also cross-platform. So a lot of times what we see is that the generative AI provider might only see one clip of how something might be made, and then how it is shared on other platforms might look very different. We can go into a little bit of defining what we mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence, but generally everyone uses the term AI. Some tools are not AI, like I mentioned, hash sharing. Um, but they might have AI overlay onto them. But this is the field of study where basically we are training and having machines that have systems that are emulating a human-like intelligence. When we think about machine learning, this is a subset within that where we're looking at pattern detection, producing various outputs that usually would be limited for humans, but expansive with this machine learning. And deep learning is this further subset. And this is complex patterns, making associations modeled on human thought. So just a little bit of linguistic difference in what we might be talking about. When we think about the AI threat landscape as it revolves around terrorism and violent extremism, we are seeing that this is already being used to try to evade moderation efforts. So terrorists and violent extremists have used AI models to try to get around safety features, to try to augment images or videos so that they might not be caught in hash sharing. We also see it used for recruitment and radicalization by different groups, where they've used generative AI to produce synthetic or augmented propaganda content that might be used to motivate future violence. We've even seen in groups like ISIS that they are using it to kind of provide their own news outlets with generative agents presenting their version of the news. It's not necessarily meant to always look like it's a completely real person, but it is meant to look slick and it's meant to be gamified and engaging to audiences. This also goes into linguistic challenges where if you think 10 years ago when we were trying to spot a bad actor, we might say, ah, but they were using bad grammar and they didn't spell something completely correctly. And nowadays, with the language translation, we're able to see propaganda translated into many, many different languages very slickly, very fluently. We also are seeing that there's some concern around using AI models for attack planning, so AI chat to search for targets and weapon information, as well as operationalization. So assisting drone targeting that's been implemented in combat environments. What we've seen developed in places like Ukraine, we are seeing now some attempts to decentralize that and use those tactics in other spaces by terrorists and violent extremists. There are things we're afraid of that we're not yet seeing, like how could AI be used for bioweaponry development or for really layering onto 3D printing. We haven't seen it go there just yet. A lot of how people are using AI in this threat landscape is how many other people are using it in its day-to-day basic needs. When we think about how AI can help platforms address threats, and AI safety, this has changed a lot in recent years. Although some of these tools, some of the AI products have been used for over a decade in counterterrorism efforts. So logo detection and X-ray image detection, those are safety features that have been in play a long time. Text classification and recidivism detection, those have all gotten more and more robust as it goes. Those are areas that it's not about in an AI system, but using AI tools across different types of platforms, including social media. So what this looks like. Well, hash sharing and matching might not in and of itself be AI, but some of the overlay tools tech companies are using are. So you can have a direct hash match, but we just talked about some adversarial shifts where you might edit an image slightly, change the color, augment it. You can actually overlay with some machine learning tooling to find fuzzy matching. So to what degree some augmentation might take place, but you could still find that image or version of a PDF or video. Strategic network disruptions have also been deployed. They are quite tooling and human resource costly, so only some of the larger platforms are deploying this. But this is when you get the tooling to work with threat investigators, with the humans. So it's a very hybrid model. And you start building out a network of bad actors that you can concretely say are associated with a certain bad actor network, whether it's terrorism, whether it's a criminal organization. And instead of the whack-a-mole approach of taking down one piece of content at a time, you do a network disruption. So you take down the entire network in one go, and it makes it really hard for that network to reform on a given platform. Added to this, what you get when you take down that core will be a bit of a donut ring of bad actors that maybe they're not fully bad actors. They weren't concretely tied to the network enough to be associated as part of that network, but they were attached or associated. Maybe they were sharing content, maybe they were in certain chats. That is then a really prime group to be injecting with counter messaging or off-ramping or redirection content. And so I know that entities like Meta have been playing around with that with some really interesting results for click-through rates and disengagement. Again, recidivism detection. If we think just 10 years ago, the heyday of ISIS or Daesh saying, look, this is my 30-second account, this is my 17th account. And that was shocking for practitioners. I remember tracking it at the time. And recidivism detection is getting better and better to use a bunch of different data signals to try to detect if it's the same bad actor attempting to recreate an account. We mentioned as well X-ray and logo detection. We see this in everything from hiding certain phraseology, hiding swastikas, hiding logos, hidden coded images. So it's very good at increasingly finding where images are embedded within things. It's also very good for things like if we're looking at live stream in real time detection of noticing elements like, and there's a gun. And so if you do layered threat detection of maybe weapon plus logo, that can do some proactive surfacing for human moderation review. And then lastly, you had mentioned that natural language processing, whereby in real time, although we see that being used by bad actors, the scale of linguistic tools to help moderators means that you get less and less of this ignorance of other parts of the world where people are flagging content and a company says, well, I just don't have the capacity to have that language full-time staffed. These processing tools are really helping. We have to remember as well that most of the interweb is text. It's not mostly image and video. We still have tons and tons of text to go through, and natural language processing really facilitates that for scaled moderation. I would encourage you for bedtime reading to go on and look at how some of the AI companies, whether that's Llama work within Meta or Anthropic or OpenAI, how they are talking about safety and trust efforts in and of themselves in their own words. It's very interesting to see how they're framing what they think of as trust and safety work. We are seeing that they're putting things in different types of risk categories. Again, the highest levels will be when you have an online action related to real world harm, how you're directing mitigation activities. A lot of the safety features they're talking about right now are prompt filtering. Of course, that comes alongside a lot of jailbreaking activities, which maybe some of you on this call have been a part of, but also contextual guardrails. So identifying the behavior signals which might indicate that somebody is trying to jailbreak in and around it. This idea of safety in AI, especially generative AI models, is almost a 180 from what our conversations were 5 years ago. If you look 5 years ago, we were saying things like AI models that are good, we need them to be replicable. Well, replicability is kind of out the window. The more an AI model eats as data, the more it might change its idea of what an answer to prompt you with is. The different time of day and location you're querying might also change what results are. So the idea that it will always give the same response is not possible. Also, we used to talk about explainability. The AI model should be able to explain back, not to over anthropomorphize them, but should be able to explain back to us why they made a certain decision. And actually, that is a little bit out the door. There are so many thousands, if not millions, of things that go into an answer that unless you are extremely specific and caring about one data query, it takes a long time to try to backwards map and explain why a decision was made. And then we used to also talk about good data versus bad data. So if there is a biased data set, a racially biased data set, something put into the AI model, how should we extract that? And actually, AI models are now talking about the idea that, well, maybe you don't want to extract that. Maybe you just need to train the AI model why that's bad, because leaving a void around that data is not necessarily the best way to make a safety effort. It's better to label it and train the model of why something might be racially biased or defective and have it understand that instead of pulling it out of the data set. That is a very different conversation compared to 5 years ago. Those are some of the ways that even how we talk about safety within AI models is shifting almost in real time. We had our AI threats and opportunities working group. Across our three working groups that I mentioned for last year, we had participants from nearly 40 countries. We had a real good split between tech, civil society, and government. So a lot of the conclusions we came to would map out things like governments are concerned with this, tech companies are seeing it in this way, civil society has fears about that. Here's where we see opportunities. We really did want to kind of understand the threats, but also those tools that we might be able to push further and best practices across the field. Some of the top recommendations, and then I'll pause to talk a little bit more with Jeremiah directly. We are seeing across the sectors that we need better definitions. This is an age-old topic for anyone looking at counterterrorism, but terrorist and violent extremist definitions do vary internationally. I will share a link, if helpful, to an entire definition site that we made to help frame this conversation, but it impacts AI strategy because if you are programming things into tools, especially at scale, we need to be very concrete. Are we going by terrorist designation lists as how we define terrorism? Which countries' lists are we going by? Some countries have very political designation lists. I would say almost every country has a pretty political designation list. Even in the UK, if you look at prescription lists, you can tell a picture about history by looking at Irish group, Irish group, Irish group, Islamist, 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 a couple white supremacist groups. That tells a story about what we see as global threats in a given country. So how does definitional variation impact moderation outcomes at scale in AI systems? We also want to be able to measure exploitation of AI against non-AI tools. Not everything is AI. We see AI being thrown around a lot, but some people are just referring to maybe not basic tools, maybe very complex, but definitely not AI tools. AI exploitation often does mimic outcomes that might be possible through non-AI tools, so we have to consider what might work best. And how does AI, how does it augment scale and skill levels for safety outcomes? So we're still testing some of these models to see what works best. It is true, though, that humans are much better in theory at nuance and tracking adversarial shifts, and technology is better at getting at scale and speed when done well. Some of these recommendations for tech specifically, we do want some standardized safety strategies and taxonomies as much as possible. That is hard to do, but GIFCT is trying to at least put some fence marks out there, some best practices, some starting points of really common goals and grounding. We also want to make sure that AI companies can share when they are successful or when they're seeing successful safety mechanisms. So some of what we do will be multi-stakeholder dialogue, and sometimes we just put tech in a room and we're like, okay, behind closed doors, please share some of your safety that's working with each other. Talk a little bit more as well about what's not working. And then for the public sector, we really do want to see some regulatory guidance for AI providers. I think we've seen more than 15 different countries and intergovernmental bodies put out different types of frameworks. There's some overlap and some discrepancies, but tech companies are looking for some guidance and the investment in strategic research to maintain this awareness of terrorist and violent extremist threat trends, because the threat trend might not be AI driven, but how we get at that threat trend could be AI facilitated for some of the kind of outcomes that we want to see and opportunities. I will stop there. I tried to give a broad spread across the AI threats and opportunities landscape, and I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation. You touched on a lot of important things, and I have a lot of questions for you. And I'm sure other folks will have some questions too. So I'll kick off our conversation and then let folks, type their questions in the chat or raise your hand. And for the folks here, bring your questions up on your note if you want to ask a question. All right. So My first sort of question, just to ease into this conversation, is if we look 5 years into the future, right? One of the last points you talked about was sort of how we were thinking about AI back then and the current landscape. What would you expect in, or what would you hope to see in the next 5 years? Do you think AI would make the world safer, especially in the context of extremism and terrorism?
Thank you for starting with such an easy question. I think I don't think 5 years ago we would have guessed how quickly generative AI would have spread as an everyday use case. We really only started talking about ChatGPT 2.5 years ago, and now everyone's used it. It's changed how teachers are even talking about pedagogy. How do you assess students because they could cheat on all their papers at home really easily? It affects a lot of things. I think we will get twofold. I think the generation gap will increase further. You have such tech fluency with younger audiences, and that comes with goods and bad. You see right now, compared to 5 or 10 years ago, governments are much more inclined to put regulation in place. You see faster regulation. So you do see quite a few parameters that are attempting to be put out on AI models. That being said, there are some very big global divides. Some countries are very pro-regulation. Europe is known to be more forward-leaning in the regulation space. And other countries are very anti-regulation, feeling like it impedes on free speech. And I think the case study there is on the US. I think we will continue to see a divide between three pillars that we all are concerned about, which is where are you solving for free speech? Where are you solving for privacy? And where are you solving for safety? These often rub up against each other. If you solve for one, it will be at the cost of the other two, usually. And with things online, you see a cause and effect. When something bad happens, there's a push in the other direction. So you get Snowden revelations, people are concerned with privacy. You get a push towards end-to-end encrypted platforms, and you get e-privacy regulation. You get Cambridge Analytica, which was not a data breach, it was a research contract breach. And you say, okay, well, we can't give such open, transparent access to researchers. And now you see many researchers saying, well, we used to have access to these tools, and now we don't. And that is an interplay. When something bad happens, the toys get taken away, or a government regulates. With AI, I think probably some of what I'm talking about today will be seen as silly in 5 years. I think the dialogue will have moved along. I think the usage of AI in so many of our tools will be normative. We're already seeing things inserted in most of our search functions or how we email. You see the prompts of helping you complete your emails. So I think some of it, our concern will go away because we're just so used to just having those tools embedded. I think the what we don't know is how advanced some of those bigger concerns of AI exploitation will be. Like, will it really change the field of bioweaponry development, implementation into drones, increased facilitation of 3D printed weapons? That's where we have fears about those case studies, but we haven't seen them yet fully develop.
Thank you so much for that. So, building off of that question, I'm thinking, especially to your last point, like we don't know how the threat is going to evolve, right? That's not necessarily clear. We just know what we see now. How, if, the problems that we're solving now, though, what are we? I was wondering if you can talk to displacement, right? Especially in the context of AI. We're trying to focus so much energy and money and attention on building these AI tools to counter terrorism, but are we just displacing the activity in online spaces and where we might not be aware of those social media companies anyways, or those platforms, those blogs, etc., that people will essentially migrate to. So what are we doing? Like, should we continue to do what we're doing? Or what?
Yeah, I love this question because you are actually presenting a catch-22 in how it's framed. Because you could say, yes, we already do know that by bigger companies being better at counterterrorism efforts, by being better at pushing out the obvious terrorist and violent extremist content, we still see attempts at hidden language and hidden symbols and memes. But when the big companies push out the obvious stuff, we don't put them in jail. Tech companies don't put them physically in jail. So we do see the migration to smaller, less regulated platforms. That is why GIFCT does not have just four companies like how it was started, but now has 39 platforms that have all worked to gain access. And a lot of those are increasingly smaller, medium platforms, and nearly 20% of those platforms are now as well non-US based, so increasingly non-US based companies. You actually can't go the other way, though. You can't go to a big platform and say, could you not counter terrorism on your platform if you find out about it so that the terrorists don't migrate? Your due diligence as a platform is if you know about terrorist, illegal, violent extremist activity, you have to moderate it. You have to get it off, and you will be held to account by CSOs, NGOs, civil society, government to hold you to account. So there's actually, even if you think migration is dangerous because it goes to the darker parts of the internet, you can't tell tech companies to therefore allow it on their platforms. And so they have to do those efforts. That is why, in part, GIFCT exists because of the recognition that platforms need to work together and understand the user journeys across platforms. The bigger divide is that there are companies willing to come to the table, even if they're not perfect. Anyone that wants to join GiveCT is already saying, hey, I have a problem. I'm willing to try to work on it a little bit with others. Not that they're all perfect, but they're trying. And then there's a lot of adversarial platforms that they're not group joiners. They don't come to the table. They have a track record of abuse on their platforms. They're not necessarily big enough and rich enough for governments to focus solely on them for crackdowns. But we all know some of the platforms I'm talking about where we see this activity squatting without a huge amount being done. So it's less about sometimes big to small, but also willing and unwilling to come to the table, and where people are sharing and using tools to get at the problem. But I agree. Migration is also not in and of itself a bad thing. The more you push bad actors into spaces where they can't just reach out to any young person or any general population is a good thing. It just makes it a lot harder for law enforcement and governments to continue to track the threat and for researchers to go those spaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So, I was thinking in the context of what you were saying about adversarial systems, and I think this also goes to a part of your presentation on the issues with defining propaganda, right? Defining terrorism. So, you had brought up like some countries, some cultures might have different perspectives on whether we should have free speech, like the context of the case study of the US, and then just the different definitions all around the globe. So I guess where I'm going with this is like, how can we ensure that, AI models aren't disproportionately flagging specific languages, religions, or political dissent as extremism, especially when social media platforms, for example, they cross borders, right? And even if a particular platform is not available in a country, there's ways to get access to these platforms. People will find a way, right? Um, and then I guess the other part of this question, or the other related issue, for a long time we hyper focused on Islamic extremism, even in countries where that's not the biggest threat in those countries. So how do we deal with all of these sort of separate issues to ensure that people aren't flagged specifically, um, for their political or religious beliefs, and tagged as extremism?
Yes, well, I will
Yeah.
not speak on behalf of governments. I have very little in my job role to persuade governments on how they should be doing designations, but I am for the definitions and methodologies nerds in the room. I am going to share a link and maybe share my screen once more because we did get this question, like why doesn't GIFCT have the one terrorist definition to rule them all? And it's because governments don't have the one terrorist definition to rule them all. So this is an interactive website that you can play around with. And we actually do look at how different parts of the world define terrorism. It is not everywhere. It's everywhere we could find a definition of terrorism. I believe there's, yeah, 64 definitions of terrorism and 18 definitions of violent extremism. So far fewer governments that have some legal framework around defining violent extremism compared to terrorism. But you can actually go through and compare and contrast and click on what is included or excluded in a definition of terrorism. Some definitions of terrorism don't say that you have to carry out any act or threat of violence. Some talk about coercion or intimidation. Some say that you could just be threatening the economic structures or social cohesion. So I would say have a little look around if you love toggling. You could kind of select none and then say, okay, which definitions only talk about an act of violence, among other things. You can do this table version. You can do this by country or supranational authority, and you can do this around violent extremism as well, which countries have those sorts of regulations. So that's for my definitions nerds out there. And then when we think about defining things, we want a really broad net. We want academics and experts to be able to question and give feedback to us and to tech companies about where to draw the line through things like our academic network, through things like our working group. We don't try to put limitations on the dialogue there. When it comes to us deploying tools, we do have a very public and open taxonomy about what is allowed to be included in the hash sharing database, because that's the point at which we don't moderate on behalf of companies, but it is allowing you to surface content that might lead to moderation efforts. In those cases, we started with common ground that tech companies could agree upon, which was the UN designated entities list around terrorism. Now, that is largely Islamist extremist terrorist groups, even at the UN level, but that is something that those groups are not ones that are as hotly contested as specific nation state prescription lists. But from there, we talked to a lot of activists and networks that said it is still limited. That is not getting at lone actor manifestos. That's not getting at white supremacy and neo-Nazi networks. So we also, outside of the UN list-based approach, we do use a behavior-based approach, which is looking specifically at the type of content coming out from a real-world behavior. So if you have an attacker and they have published a manifesto or a live stream, in and of itself, that is content and its behavior is related to the justification of the real world violence. It's related to an act of terror exploiting and giving fear and trying to intensify the impact of an attack. And we can label those and share those hashes as well. So things like branded terrorist and violent extremist content where the incitement to violence is within the material or the material associated directly with an attack. And we have multi-stakeholder feedback sessions anytime there is an incident that has that type of content associated with it. We also contact the local law enforcement of the government affected after that takes place so they understand any actions we're taking. And then every year or two, we'll get a working group to really question where are we drawing the line? Is that correct? So broad net on definitions for academia and experts questioning things. And then as soon as it comes to our tools, it becomes very narrow and based on both a list-based and behavior-based approach.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I have tons more questions, but I want to open it up also to folks virtually. I do have some questions that some folks turned into me in person, but does anybody have any questions that's here with us on Zoom that would like to chime in on this conversation? You can drop your question in the chat or raise your hand. All right. So I'll ask some questions that I got in person. So how do you feel about the safety threat assessment from AI companies in sort of the wake of, things like assisted suicide? And in the context of, I guess I'll give an example in the context of terrorism. I was thinking one thing that came to mind is sort of the engagement that Solomon Henderson, who he engaged in mass school shooting, I think last January, and he was engaging in conversations, and there was some evidence that AI was involved in the conversations in terms of him producing his own manifesto, his own diary, before he engaged in that school shooting. So I guess just in general, how do you feel about safety threat assessments efforts from AI companies specifically, right? Because I think we talked a little bit about, so we talked more about social media companies and how they work with you, and I do know you have AI partners, as you mentioned at the beginning. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and you mentioned the Antioch shooting, which was in our incident response protocols. We ended up doing, and I'll try to find the link about that. We did kind of post about it, and we did end up hashing content around it. One of the things we do after any moment like that is, and you will always see this cat and mouse of we think we've covered and thought through lots of threats, and then we see something new being used. But in the aftermath, we do a debrief that might take place a week or two afterwards, just for members to really deep dive on what signals were at play, what platforms do we think were exploited, what did that exploitation look like, and that leads to a pretty weighty dialogue about how could that have been prevented in the future. I think, again, a lot of these generative AI models or AI models that are really helping think through processes on behalf of people, I don't think we've fully cracked the trust and safety net. I think companies are at the table to say, how do we do this better? And again, I would go to some of the AI platforms to hear how they're framing their own trust and safety efforts or what they're looking at. But I know a lot of them are also, especially in the aftermath of these big events, proactively looking at third parties to do some red teaming with them to say, okay, what were you able to do? How were you able to jailbreak? What is still raising awareness? I mean, the suicide and self-harm is not my harm topic area, but again, we've learned from each other to say, sometimes the things that you think of as keywords or phrases or things to put a seatbelt on top of aren't the obvious phraseologies. For example, when I was working at Meta back in the day on their dangerous organization team, I remember somebody working on the suicide and self-harm team saying, well, actually, the biggest verbal indicator in our systems that someone might carry out self-harm or assisted suicide is talking about aspirin. And that wouldn't have been, not my world, but that is not what I would have immediately thought of. And the same goes for things like looking to carry out harm or assisting in a certain ideology. It's not always the keywords or phrases you immediately go to. And that's why you absolutely need to work with experts or people that are burying themselves in these online communities to say, actually, have you been looking for this? An example as well of when you just get thrown off and why you need to work on the ground with local experts is when I was last in Singapore working with a group of researchers. They offhandedly said, well, I hope you're looking at cauliflower memes. And I said, I am absolutely not looking at cauliflower memes. I'm really thrown off. I have no idea. I don't go into vegetation much in my field. And they said, well, no, because in India, there's been increased hate speech against Muslims, and there was an attack on a farmer's field. It happened to be a cauliflower field, and now there's Hindutva extremist language spreading, and they're using cauliflower memes to associate with carrying out attacks against Muslims. I said, that is extremely important to know that visual link of a meme or a reference to cauliflowers with a racial attack or incitement. So, like any of these things, you learn more from mistakes than successes sometimes. And I think every attack that we've tracked that has gone through our incident response protocols brings up something new that we are trying to dissect and pull apart with different tech company members.
Oh, thank you so much. So I guess the issue there we talked you just mentioned some issues, right? So I guess do you have an example of like that can be a specific or general, but just of a company that they had a huge problem, right? And they were able to successfully solve that problem and work with Gift, right? Just someone that an example that you can spotlight as like, hey, you see, this is how our partnership can work really well. Look at what we did to clean this particular activity up.
We do try, although even for good, we do try not to name and shame companies too much. We let them kind of do that in their own voices. But one thing I will point to that maybe people can mess around with is we do try to highlight and make it easier for you to find different company resources that they publish, because not everyone like us goes out of their way to read everyone's transparency report, look at their safety centers. So this is a resource guide. It has a lot of our own resources in there as well. But at the bottom, there is a link out from Appendix B, and I'll link it for you here anyways. And I'll share my screen to look what that looks like. So you can find any company that works with us. We try to keep this updated so that you can actually go in and see where their policies are, where their transparency reports are, their safety centers, where they have a statement on human rights, and you can do it by category. So you might want to just link to everyone's safety center, and it will give you a bit more about what reporting looks like, what their safety tools and tactics look like. So I would say have a little look. You might be surprised. Maybe not for some, maybe yes for others. We were really impressed by, if I will give one example, because they shared it publicly. Xbox, we are looking a lot at extremism in gaming. And when we were talking with Xbox, they said that one thing that had been really hard is when you are in a game and you're in a multiplayer game and you were to see something like maybe a mod character that was wearing a swastika or a character named Adolf Hitler, let's say, easy example. The idea of like getting out of the game to report something or trying to screenshot it and then going in later kind of defeats your purpose in a game to be in time, in real time, trying to fix something. And by just creating some tooling where you could record in real time and give a voice audio message back to moderators, they had a true positive rate of trust and safety flagging go up exponentially because it didn't affect the in-player game. So players could still keep playing and not mess with their game, but they could record at the same time and give voice back to moderators of why they thought something was violating that they were witnessing in gameplay. And they said it was a game changer. So these tooling ways of actually encouraging and promoting people to flag this so that we catch adversarial shifts is also really important.
Thank you. I think that goes well into the next question I got is what is there any like you mentioned the potential use of AI to develop bioweapons? That was part of the conversation earlier. Is there any sort of real threats upcoming, I guess, threats that people are not focusing too much on, but there's a lot of chatter in the background. It's like we really have to focus on this like as soon as we can because there's a lot of people talking about it, whether it be bioweapons as you know, as came up in the conversation or anything else. I think you had also mentioned drones. And we, of course, to the comment you just made about video games, we know that certain groups have actually created video games to train people on how to use drones in the game so that they can use that in real life, right? So I guess any chatter of some things that are extremely concerning that we might not be prioritizing right now.
It's really hard to prioritize. And I mean, here's the link that came out from the last working group, the AI threats and opportunities working group that had AI companies at the table with us. It's very hard to put um, tons of resources towards something when it's what we call left of boom. So it's usually when something goes terribly wrong, then you have that moment of like, yes, we need to move resources towards that. And it's really hard because there's so many potential areas you might want to look into and safeguard, and you still have to prioritize which teams, which engineering teams, what groups are going to work on this quarter, this half, this year. And we do see that with this, I guess the biggest concerns are less the higher prevalence, low risk AI exploitation. So making more terrorist propaganda. We're already seeing that it's facilitating with propaganda development. That is higher prevalence with lower risk. And I say that because if you talk to data scientists and you look at AI content generation, just because you can make more content does not make it better content. And even if it's better looking content, that does not have a like for like with more viral content. Content going viral or spreading still has to be shared through trusted networks, certain voices, has to be believable, has to play into cognitive bias. So just making a bunch of AI generated terrorist and violent extremist content doesn't necessarily turn the dial overnight over people joining a group. Um, it's more concerning about maybe areas that we're concerned of that are low prevalence, high risk. So when you mix the hardware with the software, if you're putting AI overlay onto drones like they've done state-led efforts in Ukraine, so things we're seeing in the theaters of war that might be exploited by non-governmental entities. I mean, I think we're even concerned when it's governmental entities exploiting them. And same thing with, 3D printed weapons. Does it facilitate making hybrid models of 3D printed guns or at-home explosive devices? Again, those are low prevalence because it takes a bit more technical skill to do those sorts of things, but higher risk as far as real world harm potentials.
Thank you. So another question that came in, which I think also kind of connects to one of the points you just made, is sort of like what motivated you to pursue this career? And I guess I see that connection there as, because you started highlighting different skills and things that, people should be paying attention to. So in the context of what motivated you to pursue the career that you have now, if you have any recommendation for folks who might watch this or who are tuning in right now to sort of work in the countering terrorism space, but specifically in online extremism, which is the area that we're primarily at, right? Whether it's working with AI. Yeah, so just what would you recommend? And if you could just share a little bit about your journey to the position that you have now.
Sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is every little girl's dream. And I think for me personally, I think it's worth remembering when I look back on this journey, my last three jobs didn't exist before I took them. These are very newer roles and positions. And so as the technology and the threat have grown hand in hand, we've just seen new types of organization, tools, and roles that are needed. It is true that sometimes working with tech, some technical positions, the tech is out teching the people, and you see tech companies fire teams, hire teams, and fluctuation. But actually, almost like the social sciences that exist around the technology are really needed. That is where a lot of human input is still of value. And so I think I partially wrote my last three job descriptions because people were like, "What do we do with this?" And I think that's a role. That's actually something we need to look at. So don't be afraid to, if you think there's a gap, there might actually be a gap. So don't be afraid to write your own job and pitch it to entities you think are working at this sometimes. I think the other thing is really this has grown so fast. When I was doing my PhD and I put forward a bunch of data that I was tracking youth trends in political social movements and tracking through, at the time, Facebook and event pages, that methodology was not taken seriously. There was this question as to whether online data could be considered real data at all, which is crazy to think about now because so much of our data, so much of what we consider data and how we get opinion and how we understand sentiment analysis is being done in the online space. But that is also only 15, just rougher, más o menos 15, 20 years old, and methodologies have had to grow exponentially. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to also consider what methodologies look like, what data collection looks like. It's a very interesting space. I started more upstream in the prevention and counter extremism space, looking at processes of radicalization, and ended up more downstream on the counterterrorism side, although still try to support the upstream. And in the prevention space, there's some really innovative work being done on positive interventions, how you embed friction points for users where you might have content that is not about moderation. You just want to make sure that you're not leading someone down a rabbit hole of violence or hate. And so how do you put friction or education points into user experiences? How do you safeguard from different networks? And at what point is there user agency? At what point is somebody seeking extreme content safeguarded? And you have to let that go. And so I think those conversations are ongoing and roles around those topics are still expanding.
Thank you. So I have two more questions for you before we close off. The this actually the next one talks a little bit to the human element, right? That what's one thing that a human moderator, for example, or an intelligence officer, and you mentioned this briefly earlier, but just to expand on that, that they can do that an AI might not ever be able to replicate, right? In the fight against terrorism.
Well, I don't know if I'd say not ever. I mean, we've seen a bunch of movies where we can't tell the difference anymore. I'm not a doom and gloomist. I think if you're a counterterrorism practitioner, you tend to be a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist, or else we wouldn't do these roles. I do think that the companionship between human expertise and tool, when done well, you see the both the scale and quality go up hand in hand. When done poorly, you can get over censorship, over moderation, bias systems. Humans aren't always even highly good at certain sensitivity metrics. I know that some moderation teams have to look at human bias as well. But I think when you get to the point where, like I talked about, strategic network disruptions, where you get the online tools being able to help identify a core network, investigators saying, here's true positives or people that we know are in this network, and then having the machine learning around it to say, well, we think they're connected here and we think there's illicit activity over here, and then having a human review and say, yeah, I think this is the shape of a bad actor network. That's extremely helpful for in-platform threat investigators, but also for law enforcement and investigation. And so I think those hybrid models really show sensitivity and bringing new data to the fore and some of the linguistic processing as well as finding patterns that humans maybe don't see in the big data. And then you scrape a system through it and it'll say, this phrase is coming up a lot, or we see that this is happening right before attacks, or how we know about patterns and user behavior is very fascinating. With all of that come a lot of human rights questions, which is why I always have a slide mentioning that we question ourselves a lot. We want to make sure that we're not using these tools at the cost of other rights. And so it's a sensitive balance. But I think in that way, humans really do catch adversarial shifts, and humans will always be needed to understand when there is an offline trend that then comes online, or when there's an online trend that manifests in a certain way offline. So humans are that nexus point between online and offline, and you might not get the context fully if you're just looking online.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much. And so the last sort of big question to bring this whole conversation together is kind of a question like if you had all the power in the world, all the power that you needed to pass one sort of global regulation that you think would be extremely beneficial in, whether it's dealing with AI directly, or just AI and national security, I mean, or AI and counterterrorism, just one global regulation in this particular space, what would it be?
I think it'd make my life a lot easier if governments did in fact have an agreed upon definition of terrorism. At the UN, you get close. You get a pretty close to a definition of terrorist acts, like
Hmm.
an act of terrorism. But that doesn't always help me in the online space when we're talking about terrorist content. But I think governments um, really having that definition so that it's not then a sideline of tech companies kind of trying to pick apart and build their own for that space. I think the other one is this is just a general comment for legislation. I'm not for or against it. If it's done well, it's beautiful. And if it's done poorly, it's not so beautiful. If governments, when they make regulation, can be very clear about what they want as the intended outcome, but don't overly make the process to get there technical, that's great. And what I mean by that is when governments try to over tech the tech solution, the tech moves so fast by the time regulation passes, you're kind of beyond it. Whereas if you just say, this is the end result we need to see, the tech companies usually will tech their way to that end result. And I think you can see different examples of that. But getting overly, when governments try to be tech, it doesn't look so good. And when tech tries to be governments, it doesn't look so good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think this was a phenomenal conversation, and I really appreciate you giving us the time and your expertise to talk about this issue. So I just want to emphasize that. Thank you so much. Let me
Thank you so
stop.
much for having me.